I'm really thrilled to meet you finally in person. We actually had a few conversations during the pandemic over Zoom, and when we talked about the future of food, and I remember your reflections on how the pandemic was changing consumer attitudes. I remember at the time you pointed out that consumers were more concerned about how food impacts their health. They were more interested in where their food comes from, and they were much more aware about sustainability. And here we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Food inflation is on people's minds. And I just wonder, how is that reshaping attitudes to sustainability and sustainable food productions when it comes to consumers and when it comes to companies like yourselves?
Yeah, great question, because clearly consumers, what's top of mind for them is the cost of living. But in terms of striving for a sustainable food system, nothing has changed for us at Unilever. And you might wonder, okay, isn't that expensive, or is that really good for consumers? Is that really good for shareholders? We believe it's actually critical for both that we continue to drive food that is healthier for people and healthier for the planet. And it's really for three reasons. The first one is food security, and I'll talk about that for a moment. Second one is there's actually savings. If you reduce food waste, for example, that's actually a saving that can go back into more affordable products. And the third reason is consumers still want it. I mean, I travel for my job all around the world. I spend time with consumers, and I've yet to meet a mother who says, well, I'd really like to feed my children food that's unhealthy. It just doesn't happen. So those trends are still there. I do want to touch on food security and why it's so intricately linked to sustainability. If any of you were on vacation in France last year, or you live in France, you'll have noticed that there was no mustard last summer. We're the biggest seller of mustard in France with the Amora and My brands. And what had happened last year is that we sourced from Canada and from France. There were droughts in Canada and floods in France, and the harvests failed in both places because of climate change. And our backup last spring was the Ukraine. We know how that ended up. There was literally no mustard. We had about 20% of the mustard seeds that we would have in a usual year. And that's because of climate change. Now, the world can probably live without mustard, but this year what we're seeing is the tomato crop in Spain will be down significantly again after being down 40% last year because of droughts. The wheat crop around the world will be the worst in centuries. So we have to change the way we farm. We have to farm more sustainably to mitigate the effects of climate change. And so sustainable farming is certainly one of our, regenerative farming is one of our focus areas that we'll continue to drive.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of regenerative farming, I know this is one of those concepts that can mean so many different things to so many different people. The definitions are rather fluid. So I was interested to know, what does regenerative agriculture mean for Unilever? What sort of initiatives you're pursuing? And if you could just talk us through, I do believe we've got some images as well you brought with us.
Well, I think, that was me in a field in Iowa, which is one of our biggest programs. But yeah, the first question people always have is, what is it? So what is it? It's practices that our grandparents used to use on their farms. So this is not rocket science. It's things like crop rotation. It's cover cropping, keeping your soils covered. It's no-till or low-till farming, so not plowing too much. It's biodiversity strips, so actually having hedges and trees around your farm. So that's not rocket science. What is rocket science is actually measuring the impacts of that versus the industrial farming that we mostly do today. And that's what we're focused on. Because what we believe and what we're seeing in our programs where we do regenerative farming, that it can reduce emissions, that it reduces the use of water, that it improves soil health, which is so critical, that it improves biodiversity, and really importantly, that it can improve farmer incomes, which of course is critical if this is to be a sustainable way of farming. So it's the outcome-based approach. I'm less worried about the exact practices. They also differ from crop to crop. Regenerative farming in tomatoes is different from regenerative farming in soy or corn. But it's about the outcomes.
And just how do you measure those outcomes? Are there any certification bodies or any databases that can be used?
Yeah.
How does it work in practice?
Yeah, great question. So, so we have a bunch of scaled programs underway where measurement is a key part of it. So I'll give you one example. I think that was the one there I was in the field in Iowa. So we have about 50,000 hectares in Iowa soy where we're farming regeneratively, and we have been doing it now for 4 years. So this is not a new program, and it's huge, obviously, at 50,000 hectares. What we're doing there is cover cropping, no-till, and a few other smaller things. And what we're measuring is soil health, is carbon matter in the soil, and water use. And what we're seeing is really, really positive outcomes. But it takes a while. And that's something that is, not always welcomed by us, fast-moving consumer goods people. We want to see results in 3 months. Well, farming, it takes a few harvests, which means it takes a few years to see the results from changing your practices. But we have to do this. We have some tools that we've developed, a cool farm tool, that's actually its name, and a field print calculator that help the farmers measure what's going on. And we're working with the WBCSD to see, can we also start sharing data, because some of our competitors laudably are also starting to really make progress in regen ag.
And you mentioned that these techniques are not rocket science. They have been with us for millennia, really.
Yeah.
And what is preventing farmers from actually adopting them? Why did we lose them? At what point? And how do you incentivize farmers to actually switch back to them?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. What happened is over the last 30 years, we've really focused, and I say we, the entire system, has focused on farmers just focusing on productivity and not so much on soil health and things that are more sustainable. Farmers know what's good for their soil. In many cases, it's their own soil that they want to preserve for their children. So they know what to do. But a transition costs money to go back to these practices. So really, I would say 2 key barriers. One is money, one is knowledge, and seeing that it's working for others. So what are we doing if I go back to Iowa to the same example? In terms of knowledge and convincing them to actually do it, we're working with a fantastic organization called the Practical Farmers of Iowa. Never knew they existed, but they're a big organization of farmers, and it's farmers showing farmers that when you go back to these practices, that is actually good for your yields, for your input costs, and for your soil. So those types of collaborations are really important. And I've got many more examples of where we work with co-ops or other farmer organizations to get the movement going. And then the second thing is financial support for the transition. It takes 3 to 5 years, and farmers do need financial support for that transition. So we have a €1 billion climate and nature fund at Unilever, and we're tapping into that to support farmers.
And just in terms of consumers as well, because how do you envisage communicating with consumers that, let's say, a jar of Hellmann's is made from ingredients that come from such farms? Where are we in terms of labeling, or, would you like to communicate that sort of message, or do you have ground plans for actually covering all your ingredients to originate from such farms?
Yeah, so our plan is for this year, we will have more than 40 programs ranging from soybeans in Iowa to tomatoes in Spain to rice in Italy and Arkansas to tomatoes in India to cover 250,000 hectares this year. And by 2025, we will have 650,000 hectares, which is about half of our footprint of land we use at Unilever. So this is not small stuff. The time for pilots, guys, is really over. We have to do this at scale. And by 2025, we'll have about 100 crop country programs up and running. Your question is a great one. How do we tell the consumer? I have to say we're still learning. Today on Hellmann's in the US, which is a huge business, it's $1 billion business, we do mention it in our marketing materials. Consumers are still a bit like, sounds good, but does it really create preference yet? Not yet. We see other things that really create preference, and they're more in the cost of living space. So if I look at right now, Coleman's in the UK is running a campaign, I think it's called Tasty Dosh for less nosh. I can't pronounce these things correctly here, but that's working pretty well. It's straight on cost of living. On Knorr in the United States, we have a fantastic collaboration with Cardi B. She's never behaved as well as in this Knorr commercial. But that's also on the cost of a meal with Knorr versus fast food, which is a really favorable comparison. So that's what's top of mind for the consumer right now is her cost of living. So that's what working more so than trying to market regenerative agriculture. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And we are absolutely clear that we're doing it, and we're doing it at scale.
And just in terms of regenerative agriculture, how does that fit in your broader sustainability plan? And you did talk about sourcing, but I was curious to know whether how important it is to your net zero strategy.
Yeah, no, great question. So at Unilever, we have a commitment to be net zero by 2039, so 11 years ahead of the Paris agreements, which is a little scary. And that means by 2030, we have to be down 40%. In food, how do you do that? We are focused this decade on reductions, not offsets. We have to reduce emissions. And in food, we do that in a number of ways. The first big building block is regenerative agriculture, because again, the programs we have in the field right now do show significant reduction in emission from changing the way we farm. So that's the first one. Second one is less plastic, which of course is a fossil fuel. We have a lot of plastic packaging. We have to reduce, and we have to recycle and make our packs made from recycled plastic. So we're at about 21% now of all our plastic packages that are made from recycled plastic. That has to go up probably to 100% for us to meet our goals. And then the last thing I'll mention is what we call eco-design, which is mainly plant-based design. So replacing animal ingredients by plant-based ingredients, that's a big part of our footprint as well. So you can think of dairy-free ice cream. A vegan Magnum is lovely. I recommend you try it. Vegan Hellmann's, the vegetarian butcher in plant-based meat, and various other products in our big range where we're replacing animal by non-animal ingredients.
So on that last point, alternative proteins, plant-based diets, I mean, cutting back on meat and animal products has been singled out as one of the most impactful climate solutions when tackling food's environmental footprint. And we did see, especially during the pandemic, we had a huge exuberance over those products, and it somewhat had fizzled out. The sales are not there in general terms. And there's a bit of struggle in terms of incentivizing consumers to actually come back and buy them again, right? So I was curious to know what are the prospects for this category? Do you think it has the future? And if so, what improvements need to be made in order to,
Yeah, great question. So the answer is absolutely. There's a bright future for meat and dairy replacements, if only because consumers still want it. In the UK, 1 out of 5 households has a vegan or a vegetarian in it today. In Europe, 60% of people say they would like to eat less meat. So that macro consumer trend is absolutely still there. our business is in really good shape. We've reported, we had a goal of €1 billion in plant-based meat and dairy replacements. We set that for 2025. We hit 1.2 billion last year. So we're growing fast. We continue to grow fast across meat and dairy alternatives. And I think what's key to your question, you know, how do we convince more consumers to replace some of their animal-based consumption for non-animal-based consumption, is taste. You know, you're just not going to eat it if it tastes horribly. So I'm really proud. I dare you to taste the difference between Hellmann's and vegan Hellmann's. You really cannot taste it. And also the vegetarian butcher, which is harder, this you know, fake meat. It's delicious stuff. We just came out with a new bacon. Oh my God, it's to die for. So taste is key. And then of course, clean label and the health profile of those products is also really important. So again, we've worked hard. All the vegetarian butcher products are now Nutri-Score A or B. So they're definitely in the healthy category. And that combination is working. So we're bullish on it. And again, we're in that space for the long term, if only because it's critical to net zero as well.
Meg, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have a couple. First question, do you see a difference in sustainable farming practices in established countries versus developed countries?
Yeah, yes and no. No, because we need practices that are better for soil health, emit less, reduce water everywhere. But the difference that we see if I compare, for example, we have a regenerative agriculture program on tomatoes in Spain and one in India with 25,000 farmers. So it's a big scaled program. And in Spain, also a large program with Agras, who is one of our suppliers. The practices and the benefits are similar. So in Spain, for example, we're seeing more than 30% emission reduction and a significant water reduction, which is so critical in an area of drought. We see similar impacts in India. However, when it comes to farmer incomes, it's very interesting because the farmers in Europe already have pretty high yields. The benefit in farmer incomes in Europe is actually from lower input cost, fertilizers and pesticides. So that's where the income benefit is in Europe. In India, where the yields were lower to start with, the farmer benefit is in higher yields. So that is a little different, but in both cases, there is a farmer benefit. And of course, the biggest benefit, honestly, you know, if I look at Spain last year, the overall tomato crop in Spain was down 40% because of drought. Our tomatoes at Agras, where we'd been doing Regen Ag for 2 years at that point, we were able to keep our yields the same. And that is a huge benefit. You know, I wouldn't have any tomato soup if it wasn't for that program.
What are the emissions of a regenerative agriculture approach versus traditional? Is it still net zero at scale?
Absolutely. That's the end goal.
Yeah.
And we have to do this. So I say the time for pilots is over. In the food industry, changing the way we farm is absolutely critical. And actually, there was an article in the FT this morning, again, on the UK struggling to get to its net zero goal, which is not different from any other country, honestly, but this one focused on the UK. And some good progress in electric vehicles, for example, but basically no progress in food and agriculture, which is such a huge part of the emissions footprint. So we have to move faster in food and ag.
Last one. So given the impact of inflation on food costs right now, do you find that consumers are hesitant to want to pay for the green premium for more sustainable products currently?
They've always been hesitant to pay a green premium, so that hasn't really changed. You know, maybe they're even more hesitant today, but you know, I tell my people at work, we have to do this. So assume we are going to do this. We are investing in regenerative agriculture. We are investing in recycled plastic. We are investing in innovation in alternative proteins, because we have committed that we'll get to net zero by 2039. And then we need to find the savings in our business to offset that, and we are.
Great. Well, Hanneke, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.